We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
And welcome to another Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutchin, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined by two podcast stalwarts this week. John Ferguson, who's the editor of the Sunday Mail, and of course Douglas Dickey of the Scottish Daily Express. Now, top issue this week, I think, undoubtedly is the Prime Minister's Brexit reset deal. Depending on your perspective, it is a long overdue rethink of our relationship with one of our closest allies, namely the EU bloc, or a violation of our sovereignty, etc. So before we talk about that, let's just listen to the Prime Minister and get his take on it.
So let me spell out the benefits of this deal, which gives our country an unprecedented level of access to the EU market. Mr. Speaker, the best access of any nation outside the EU or EFTA, strengthening our national security through our new security and defence partnership. Mr. Speaker, that paves the way for British defence firms to access the EU's €150 billion defence fund. That will support British jobs, British wages, British livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, it also strengthens our borders because, again, the previous deal left a huge gap, weakened our ability to work together to tackle illegal migration, the ultimate cross-border challenge. This partnership closes that gap, including joint work on returns, preventing channel crossings and working upstream in key source and transit countries, cooperating along the whole migration route to strengthen our hand in the fight against the vile smuggling gangs. Mr. Speaker, it helps British holidaymakers because they will be able to use e-gates when they travel to Europe, ending those huge queues to passport control. And it delivers for our young people because we're now on a path towards a controlled youth experience scheme with firm caps on numbers and visa controls. A relationship we have with so many countries around the world, some actually even set up by the party opposite. But last but certainly not least, Mr. Speaker, we've a new SBS deal, as promised in our manifesto, that will cut the price of the weekly shop, more money in the pockets of working people, less red tape for our exporters. No more lorry drivers queuing for 16 hours at the border with rotting food in the back. No more needless checks, the inevitable consequence of their policies that made it so much harder to trade, even within our own market, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Because, Mr. Speaker, not only does our deal on fish provide stability, with no increase in the amount that EU vessels can catch in British waters, it also provides a new SBS agreement which slashes costs and red tape for our exports into the European market. We sell 70% of our seafood into that market. It is a huge opportunity, which our £360 million investment in British fisheries will now look to export.
So, trying to look at this from a punter's perspective, it does seem like if this deal goes through and there are no problems with it, then holidaymakers will find it easier to go through European airports to destinations such as Spain. It looks like businesses are going to find it easier to trade with EU partners. There's sort of tentative steps towards a youth mobility scheme. On the downside, of course, you've got the issue about extending the access of European boats into Scottish waters for fisheries. But if you look at the reaction of all of the business groups, it seemed to be largely positive. And if something was going to be really bad for the economy, you would expect the business organisations to be flagging this up. And I don't know what you think, John, but I think this is going to be, on balance, a popular deal with the public. I think they were longing for a reset, that they wanted a new relationship with the EU, and this is probably the first step in that endeavour.
Yeah, if anything, it's surprising that this hasn't come sooner, to be honest. I don't think it's any secret that Keir Starmer was never the biggest fan of Brexit. He did everything to try to guide his party into a more Europe-friendly position when he was in the shadow cabinet. I suspect in his heart of hearts, he knows that Britain would be better off back in the European Union. He obviously knows that that's politically not going to happen for now, but this is I think the first steps into essentially a soft Brexit position, and I would be surprised if we don't see, certainly under a Labour government, a creeping continuation of these sorts of policies that basically bring the UK more into line with the European Union, make it easier for businesses, etc. If you think back to Brexit, the main arguments for Brexit was that somehow it would make us all richer, i.e. it'd be good for the economy, and also there was this question of immigration, uncontrolled immigration. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of water under the bridge, but I don't think you would. It'll be 1 in 1,000 of that people in business leaders that will say that Brexit was good for the UK. I think it's obviously been a bad thing. And in terms of that immigration, we've seen uncontrolled immigration explode since then. So I don't think it's surprising that Keir Starmer's trying to gently ease the UK back onto speaking terms and better trading terms with the EU, and I hope he continues with that. It does appear, however, that in doing so, we're seeing one of Scotland's big industries, fishing, potentially suffer with this new deal. So that's going to cause issues, but really, I think overall this is a good thing, and it will be interesting now to see how the right-wing media who supported Brexit, the Reform Party, etc., respond.
Dougie, the right-wing press did cry betrayal. They think it's they think that it's an insult to people who voted for Brexit. But my experience of talking to people who voted for the UK to leave the EU is they wanted a pragmatic Brexit. And whatever you think about that decision, there were lots of things such as the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland, trading issues that just weren't working properly. And do you not just sense that the British public are longing for responsible politicians to work constructively with our EU partners? And that's what they've got in this instance.
I think, kind of similar to the Scottish independence debate, you've probably got kind of 10-15% on either side that is very entrenched. So, and it's them that make the most noise. So, you had Remainers going on about how Brexit was going to be the worst thing ever and it was a complete disaster, which was untrue. It's not been the worst thing ever. And then you've got Brexiteers who say that any kind of relationship with the European Union is a betrayal. But of course, none of that was really set up. The country voted for Brexit. We left the European Union. That was that was what happened. That was the reality of the kind of situation. And I think it's been, I think people are that kind of silent majority are tired of fighting this battle. That's kind of 10 years on. We're almost 10 years on from the Brexit referendum, and I think people are kind of fed up. And ultimately, the proof of this will be in a year's time. Has it affected the pound in my pocket? Has it brought food prices down? I mean, I was talking to my wife about this yesterday. I still can't get my head around how much we're having to pay for food. I know it's now like the norm, but it still seems incredible to me that food prices are so much higher than they were even just 5 years ago. And if in a year's time the man in the street has more money in his pocket, that's when they'll judge this kind of Brexit deal. I think it's been a good few weeks for Sir Keir Starmer. I know it's not often I would kind of concede that, but given the kind of trade deal with India, the trade deal with America, it seems that on the international stage he's having a lot more success than he is on the domestic stage.
100%. I spoke to a relative and I said, look, isn't the Prime Minister doing well internationally? And the person said, how about folk back home? So he needs more good news, I think, on the domestic front.
Well, he's obviously the kind of winter fuel, kind of half a U-turn, I suppose. But ultimately, if people if it does, I've never really had an issue getting through passport control since Brexit. I don't really kind of recognise these kind of massive queues. But, you know, if your average punter sees a difference when they go on holiday, if they see a difference in food prices, the fisherman thing, I mean, it is disastrous for fishermen, but ultimately, John, you said it's one of Scotland's biggest industries, but UK wide, it's only worth like 0.4% of, you know, GDP. And I think Sir Keir Starmer, if there's one thing he's proven since he came in, it's that he doesn't really care about upsetting people who won't vote Labour anyway. And I think this is another gamble, I suppose, that he thinks, well, if I upset the fishermen, it's not going to really impact on our electoral chances. And
I have to say, just on fish, Doug, the SNP were all over the place on this deal this week. I think John Swinney started off by saying that fishing interests had been surrendered, and then there was a massive rowing back of that. But if you think about it, the SNP's position is that they want to go back into the EU, which means signing up to the Commons Fisheries Policy, which means EU boats having permanent access to Scottish waters. I mean, it's just...
I mean, I guess what Swinney's point is that we've given the EU something on fishing in order to win other concessions, and so we've given them something that impacts Scotland negatively in order to get a bunch of concessions that perhaps are more beneficial to City of London.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of the industries that are going to be trading more freely with the EU, they will be based in Scotland as well. So I don't think it's just like English industries are benefiting from the deal.
Yeah, and
UK
likewise, universities in Scotland are probably going to benefit from the proposed new rules on young people being able to stay in the EU and vice versa. So it's six, and you know, you have to weigh it all up. But I think that the only real position for the SNP to take on this is that we would be better being a full member, and that potentially Scotland are being seen as the smaller partner in this negotiation yet again.
Yeah, I think John Swinney, I've said before, hasn't really put a foot wrong since the budget, but I think his initial response to this Brexit deal was a bit of a misstep. I think he's just growing used to criticising whatever the UK government does, and maybe just needed to take a step back and just see this in the round.
I think that's the problem with, you know, the SNP really, is that they constantly, unless it's something really obvious like Ukraine, they're always going to take the contrary position to the UK government, because it doesn't suit their argument to say that the UK government's doing a good job. Now, what Swinney should have come out and said was, the best thing for the UK is to be part of the EU, and then we wouldn't have to give concessions, or, you know, we would have had all this anyway without all the upheaval. But it just shows how wedded in their psyche that just coming out, you know, they moan about people always going SNP bad, it's SNP bad. Well, they're Britain bad constantly. Kate Forbes was on top. I mean, I just jaw-dropping hypocrisy. And it shows you the mess they're in as well, because Stephen Flynn's out at kind of Westminster saying, no, it's not a surrender, yet that's the message his boss is putting out 24 hours earlier. Now, is that Stephen Flynn's leadership ambitions maybe haven't quite been extinguished? He's obviously going to be at Holyrood next year, probably. So, you know, they're not even on the same page as each other on it. And it's as you say, Swinney has performed okay. He's kind of arrested the SNP side, but this one's been a real a bit of fudge from him, I think.
Completely different subject. Ash Regan, who is the Holyrood group leader of Alba, former SNP Community Justice Minister, I think. She had an event yesterday at Holyrood. I was there, basically launching a bill to criminalise the purchase of sex. Now, I'm not an expert in this area of the law, but I think by and large, right now, the risk is with the seller of sex, i.e. the sex worker or the prostitute, rather than the person who buys the sex. Her bill would turn the tables, basically decriminalising prostitution when it comes to the seller and criminalising the buyer. Now, there were a lot of quite emotional testimonies at the event. There was one woman who spoke about how she was in prostitution at the age of 15, was then working in Edinburgh saunas in her early 20s. I think she had over 10 clients a day for 11 years. And as you can imagine, it's been a hugely traumatic experience for her. Do you think, in terms of the realpolitik of this, do you think this is likely to pass before the next election, given how tight it is? And also, will the Scottish Government help? Because it doesn't strike me as the sort of issue that John Swinney would naturally warm to. It's a controversial issue. I think you probably prefer to focus on what he regards as bread and butter issues.
Yeah, I mean, we've only just finished discussing assisted dying, and now this kind of lies, lands on our lap, a really complex and nuanced policy and issue. I don't think it will get through before. I just don't think time's on Ash Regan's side with this one. And after that, I think the chances of Ash Regan being at Holyrood this time next year, are incredibly slim. So it may well just die a death. It'll be very interesting to see, where lines are drawn. I read, obviously, the Record Splash this morning, and
we'll come to that. Yes, don't worry about that.
And there's, even within the industry, there seems to be differing views on it about it, potentially pushing this stuff underground. Although, I mean, prostitution kind of seems already underground, in a sense. It's a very, very difficult one. It's another one where I wouldn't want to be a politician having to kind of make this decision. But yeah, it's a bit out of John Swinney's comfort zone. I think it's not really his bag. I don't think he would try and obstruct it or be obstructive towards it, but I can't see it being something that he takes on with any great gusto.
John, the Record had a splash this morning. I interviewed Ash Regan after the event. Basically, she told me that a recently exited prostitute, someone who'd left prostitution very recently, had contacted her and told her that there were some male MSPs, serving MSPs, who'd been clients of hers and that she recognised them from the television. Now, we didn't name names or anything like that, but that does raise some pretty serious issues if it's true.
Yeah, I mean, if true, then you have to question whether these are the correct people to be legislating in this area. We'll see, I guess, over coming days and weeks whether there are any names mentioned in relation to this or not. I think the wider issue, even if John Swinney was someone who was minded to do Ash Regan a favour, which I don't think he is, it would be unlikely that he would really want to start getting behind this simply because it's such a contentious issue. There are going to be very reasonable and deeply held arguments on either side. Obviously, prostitution is an industry which is rife with exploitation and abuse, so anything that can make the lives of women who are in that industry better and also give them options to come out of that industry is a good thing. The problem is that it will be far from clear whether this policy is the correct one to do that or whether a different approach is better, and I think that's where Ash is probably going to run into difficulty with this. I have to say, on the face of it, it doesn't seem like an unreasonable idea to me, but I'm not an expert, and I think you do need to take into account what the police and the NHS. There's a whole bunch of opinions that you need to listen to on this before you come to any kind of decision.
Yeah, I don't have a fixed view on it in terms of the bill and the proposal, but I remember about a decade ago I used to write about Edinburgh saunas a lot. Edinburgh saunas are basically brothels, and I wrote about it from the perspective of who ran these establishments, who owned them, and invariably it was horrible guys with criminal convictions. And the more I looked into it, it was just a horrible, horrible world. And if I had a daughter and she was working in that industry, I would move heaven and earth to try and get her out of it. And I think, any father would probably feel the same way. So I don't know how it's going to go. It should probably run out of time, but I think it's definitely a debate worth having.
It's one of these areas, isn't it, where people say, oh, well, people are exploited in all different ways in lots of different lines of work, but this is a particularly nasty industry with a lot of very nasty people involved in it, and I think that you do need to start from the basic premise that it would be much better that women didn't feel they had to be involved in it.
It does seem a wee bit like treating the symptom rather than the illness, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just, as John said, the fact that women are forced into this kind of living is what we should really be focusing on.
And the link to trafficking as well.
Well, yeah,
the
kind of human trafficking side of it, which is a major issue in this country and kind of goes unnoticed a lot of the time. But it does feel a bit like, sticking plaster to an extent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't do some good, and it's not that doesn't make it a bad idea.
Sure, Ash Regan reminds me just a little bit in spirit of Margot MacDonald, the former Lothians MSP, but interestingly they had completely different views on prostitution. Margot MacDonald, when she was an MSP, was for prostitution tolerant zones. Ash Regan, another pro-independence politician, has gone for a completely different approach. But I think it's good when MSPs raise difficult issues like this. It's very easy for an MSP to go to the Scottish Parliament, fill their expenses, take the whip, go home. It's much more difficult to raise a controversial issue. So I think hat tip to Ash on this one. Third and final subject, my favourite subject right now. I said that last week. The Hamilton, Lark Hall and Stonehouse by-election. It's not much of an update from last week, which is Labour heads are down. Reform are very confident of getting second place. One of the main developments is that there's going to be an SDV candidates debate on June the 2nd. You would imagine that Labour would be chomping at the bit to have their candidate, Davy Russell, on that TV slot. They've decided not to take part, so it looks like it may just be a head-to-head between Reform and the SNP. It's a pretty dismal situation to be in, isn't it, John, when Labour have a candidate that they don't have enough confidence in him to put him on the TV?
Yeah, I mean, it's a disaster. It almost feels like that's them throwing the towel in. If you can't trust your candidate to go on TV and support his candidacy, then how can you possibly expect the people in the constituency to vote for him? I have noticed that on pretty much all of the promotional videos, Davy's been there with an ass or someone else, and it always seems to be the someone else that's doing the talking. I did notice today, the first time that he's kind of said anything of particular substance.
I was there. He did say something of substance.
And he's come out and says that he thinks that the winter fuel payment should be given back to everyone. Now, was he freelancing or not? Who knows?
And I said that he thought that the means test should be extended a little bit, but then Davy Russell just went in and said, just reinstate it all.
Brilliant. So did they mess that up, or was it planned? I suspect.
Candidate's license, I think.
Yeah. Everyone that I've spoken to within the Labour Party that's been knocking doors and campaigning for this by-election is pretty despondent, and they are, I think it's fair to say, alarmed at the number of people who are saying they're going to be voting Reform. If we needed more evidence of this rise of a new party in the UK, this is it.
Dougie, what are the optics of the STV debate? Labour getting empty chaired, and it's just Reform versus the SNP, giving Reform a massive shot in the arm a few days before polling day.
Well, I think Reform probably can't believe their luck here. It's just what an opportunity for them, I suppose, to go head to head with the party defending the seat, presenting themselves maybe justifiably now as the best bet, the best vote to stop the SNP taking the seat. The only thing I will say is I'm always a wee bit wary of how much we kind of put into these TV debates, how much they really move the needle, how much they really change people's minds. To me, the kind of people who are tuning in will have already decided how they're voting, and you'll have Reform voters tuning in to get very angry about the state of the country, and you'll get SNP voters tuning in to see how great they think their candidate is. But I mean, it doesn't look good for Labour at all.
That it doesn't move the needle. The only thing that might move the needle is not actually showing up for it.
As if you don't turn up, and all this stuff we've been discussing about Brexit deals, even though that's a reserved matter and this is the devolved election. It's all going to come too late for Labour, far too late in the day. I think I posed this question last week. Can Reform win the seat?
It's a question that some of us on the media floor have been asking, and I've been speaking to politicians as well. I think Reform's main weakness is a lack of voter ID. I think they're chapping doors, not really knowing what people think, whereas Labour and SNP have got much more detailed data. So that is a problem for them, but they are running a very organic, grassroots-led campaign. I think first place is probably out of bounds for them, but I would imagine that June the 5th is going to be their high point so far in Scottish politics.
One thing that I have heard is that as much as Davy Russell doesn't seem like a brilliant candidate, the main thing people are hearing on the doors is that Keir Starmer's very unpopular, and that's got to be a wake-up call for the whole of the Labour Party, not just in Scotland. As we were talking about earlier, he's doing quite well in the international stage, but there is a perception problem domestically that isn't going away.
Yeah, it's a bit like, I think, George H. Bush when he was US president. He was perceived to have done really well internationally, I think the first Gulf War, but there was a recession back home, and then he lost to Clinton in 92. So I think that the next budget is a real biggie for Rachel Reeves. It has to be a budget of good news, actually making people better off and tackling the cost of living crisis, because if folk don't feel like they're better off in 4 or 5 years' time, this is going to be a one-term government.
I mean, international relations is probably the hardest thing to master about politics, and yet you probably get the least credit in the bank from actually mastering it or doing well in it, because at the end of the day, I sit here every week, if people don't feel the benefit in their back pocket, that's ultimately what's going to decide. It's going to decide the Holyrood election next year, probably.
Great, I think that wraps it up. So thanks very much to John and to Dougie again for joining me. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Music, or watch it on the Records YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.